When it puts Parkrun as a charity in a difficult position, as I say, officially their motto is to empower people to come together. And yet, whatever they decide, whatever they do on an issue this divisive, seems likely only to do precisely that and divide people.
Man, why is it divisive, though? That's my question. Because the issue itself is not divisive by default in its nature. Like, there's a very easy way to, like, talk about this complicated issue when it comes to trans women in the higher echelons of competitive sports. Because, like, you get together with a bunch of experts in sport and athletics and scientists. You get a bunch of them together and be like, okay, what's good? How do we make this as fair as possible? Because people are saying it's potentially unfair. That's a boring conversation, though. That's not very fun to listen to or to watch, and it certainly doesn't get people to come out to vote for you. It seems like it's a divisive issue because politicians have made it one in order to get people to vote for them out of fear of barely a percentage point of the population. So I was scrolling Twitter, which I've done less and less as time has gone on, particularly, you know, because my mental health has improved on the whole for a variety of reasons, and for that reason, there's not really much of a reason for me to get on Twitter or any other social media. It seems like I was doing that more when I was less mentally well. Funny how that works. And then I was scrolling along, and I became British for a brief moment. Usually, I'm pretty anti-UK. I make a lot of fun of them. They still have a monarchy. That's hilarious to me in a kind of sad, macabre way. For as much of a show as it is, it's still in existence, and I find that to be pretty cringe. And then I found this, and I was like, huh, another UK outlet talking about trans issues? Let's see what's up. From Sky News, parkrun is facing a backlash over its decision to scrap all-time records after a row of transgender athletes taking female records. Sky's Matthew Thompson has been speaking to runners in Clapham this morning to get their reaction. What kind of a name is Clapham, man? What is that? This is not a real place. So parkrun is like an event that's happening, and I guess an organization where people just go to the park and they run, and it's fun. So I was like, oh, so the way that this video is being framed, like, oh, I would imagine a lot of these people are going to be kind of reciprocating what's being said in this tweet. You know, facing backlash, people seem to be mad about this trans stuff that are participating in parkrun. So let's see what they have to say. You know, I figure, why not listen to some people be a bit cringe about trans issues? Let's see.
I think it's more of a hot topic when it comes to Olympics. When it comes to parkrun, I know parkrun's grown to a global event now, but I think people have got to remember as well that it is just a bit of a get-together, a bit of fun on a Saturday morning.
I think
on a Saturday morning,
the debate about trans people in sports has been blown out of proportion, and I think make sports more inclusive. That's the conversation that we should be having.
I think everyone should just go there and have fun. It's Saturday morning, 9 AM. Like, let's all just go and have some fun and race. And if people want to look at the stats, then they can. If they don't,
I think just anyone and everyone should be able to do it and have access to it.
Normal people have finally been given a microphone in mainstream media to voice their opinions on trans issues, specifically trans women in sports. And it turns out nobody gives a fuck. Nobody cares, because this is so rare that it ever presents any kind of tangible issue to anybody's lives. So, like, and you can see why I thought that, like, the people in this video might be, you know, voicing some takes I might disagree with and be a bit more transphobic, because they kind of, you know, set you up for that. Facing a backlash over its decision to scrap all-time records after a row over transgender athletes taking female records. Like, you expect the backlash to kind of be reciprocated in the video that they've attached to it. It turns out, no, it's just a bunch of normal-ass people being like, no, it's just a bit of fun. I could see how it's a bit more of an issue when you talk about Olympic-level sport, but when it comes to parkrun, we're just a bunch of people having fun. It's not really a big deal. I think inclusivity is good, actually. You know, I'm normal. I've got a day-to-day life that actually includes me socializing with other people, so I don't really care that much, frankly. It's not really a thing that's on my mind very often. Like, they finally found normal people to interview, and it was probably a mistake, to be honest, because, like, usually you've got, like, absolute freaks that don't do anything social and are just, like, hyper-obsessed with trans people, even though they're, like, barely a percentage point of the population. Turns out, the average Joe in the UK, bruv, at least that are participating in parkrun, don't actually care too much about the trans people in their sport. You know, in the Olympic level, it makes sense. You gotta figure that out. But I have to say, I don't really give a fuck. That's great. I love to see it, you know? So, like, the other two people are a bit more woke, if you will, because they're, like, directly talking about, like, oh, inclusivity is good, poggers. And, you know, I agree with that. But even this, I think this is, like, the median opinion. Like, quite frankly, I think this is the guy. Like, this is Joe, and he's pretty average. No disrespect. Like, this is we found him. This is average Joe.
I think it's more of a hot topic when it comes to Olympics. When it comes to parkrun, I know parkrun's grown to a global event now, but I think people have got to remember as well that it is just a bit of a get-together, a bit of fun on a Saturday morning.
Like, we found him. It's average Joe with a reasonable take. Why do people care? Like, I can understand if you're, like, in the highest echelons of sport. There's a conversation to be had there. I've talked about it in the past. But when it comes to a bit of fun on a Saturday morning, or, like, sport in, like, elementary and middle school, I don't care. For one, because in elementary and middle school, like, puberty is hitting around, what is it, like, late middle school or some shit? I don't fucking remember. And, like, at that point, the so-called advantages that AMAB people might have usually only occur after puberty. Because by that point, the dominant hormone in the body, as it pertains to whatever the biological sex is, in this case, testosterone for AMAB people, tends to kick in, and that has benefits for muscle repair and growth. And there's a lot of things that, biologically speaking, can make male athletes, like, progress in their fitness at a faster rate. Obviously, there's a conversation to be had there when it comes to that. I don't know that it needs to be a national issue like it's being portrayed as, because I think most people don't care. But, like, when it comes to elementary and middle school sports, like, it doesn't matter. I don't know why there are different leagues. Because, like, any so-called biological advantages don't really occur at those ages. So at that point, like, you're just doing it because you want to segregate the girls and the boys in sports. And usually, I think the real answer for that these people are pretending or hiding behind the trans issue with is that they, generally speaking, think boys and men are superior to women and girls. And I don't think that's true, actually. Like, it is the case that testosterone can give you some potential advantages when it comes to being an athlete and, like, the way testosterone helps muscle repair faster, whatever. But, like, it's not like a cheat code. It does still require work on the part of the athlete. It's not like your average Joe would be able to take on, you know, a trained athlete in women's sports and win. Like, there was actually a video that, like, a TikTok somebody posted. Does anybody have a link to that? It's a TikTok of this one track runner, and she was challenged by, like, her boyfriend's friend or some shit who isn't an athlete to a race because he thought that just because he was a guy that he would be able to win. And he got rolled and smoked, as one would expect. I gotta find that now. Woman runner challenged by non-athlete man TikTok. There we go. God, I hate TikTok on desktop. So this is it. This is from Lana Zach. Alana Sabakan. So here it is. She explains it all, I believe.
I am a D1 track athlete. About this one time, I, for some reason, raced my boyfriend's friend over 400 meters. He refused to believe that a woman could beat him in a race. He does not run, but he challenged me to 400 meters. And I only agreed because I was doing a 400 workout already, so I was like, sure, join me. Then he ended up bringing both his parents, his family, his friends, and I was like, what the heck did I get myself into? But to narrate what went down, I just ran the first 200 meters with him. I just stayed with him. I'm not exerting myself for no reason. I have nothing to prove here. If you're crazy enough to challenge a 400, 800 athlete to a 400 race, that's on you. I'm not going to correct you. And then since he does not
And you wouldn't really have to correct them because, like, your actions will speak louder than words.
At all, his lack of fitness really hit him hard after 200 meters. And I was like, okay, let me just go now. And then, as you should always do, I finish hard because that's what you do as a track runner. And this was also one of the reps of my 400 workouts. So I'm just doing my workout here. So yeah, there's me pushing hard. I actually felt some lactic. And then, yeah, so the gap was widening. And I actually ended up running 57 for this, which is pretty good for practice.
Look at this guy. He's gassed. That's funny as hell. But, like, this is an insight into what all this rhetoric kind of produces in, like, the minds of men. Like, the rhetoric around men and boys being, like, inherently superior to women and girls in their respective leagues in sport. 'Cause it ends up leading to very foolish, mediocre men being like, oh, yeah, man, I could totally beat this D1 track athlete in a 400. I totally could do this because I am a guy, and I've been told my whole life that we are superior to girls, just generally speaking, and especially in athletics. When that's not actually the case. If you actually look into the history, by the way, of women's sport and why it exists as a separate division or league to begin with, it wasn't necessarily because like women were having a terrible time in sports because they were always getting beat by men. It was oftentimes because men were getting beat by women who were better, and they didn't like that because misogyny was even more rampant back then than it is now. So they were like, okay, we got to make sure that these people who we perceive to be less than us, even though they're clearly better in at least athletics because they're winning, I don't want to feel less masculine for having lost this fair race. So we're going to make it unfair by just removing them from the competition and giving women their own league. And then it's been morphed into like this bastardized version of feminism being like, oh, well, you know, women, they need to have the league because XYZ. And I've talked about this in the past before. There is a reason for women's only leagues to exist. And that's usually going to be because of social reasons, not because of any kind of biological advantage conversation dumbasses want to make. It's going to be because, for instance, in, let's say, esports, because this comes up sometimes. There was this one, I think we did a video on it. There was this one person that was in a women's league in League of Legends, and she had lost to a team that had trans women on it. And she was really mad, like, oh my god, they need to have their own league. Like, I'm not necessarily against them playing League of Legends competitively, but they're not, like, true women, so they have to have their own league. For whatever reason, men are just inherently biologically superior to women in the realm of League of Legends competitive gaming. It doesn't make any fucking sense. And there's no actual, like, biological reason for that. The reason for why men tend to be better at esports than women is because men have been socialized to be interested in video games more than women. The demographics have shifted in a positive direction to be more inclusive for people who are playing video games. But in the past, video games were, when they were like Tetris and whatnot, it was like the domain of adults and kids, I guess. But eventually, marketing for video games kind of shifted to being for kids and specifically for young boys. And a lot of the advertising reflected that. A lot of the video games that were made reflected that. There weren't a lot of games made like tailored to the young girl demographic or even like women demographic. It was all just men and boys, and specifically it was looked at as a kids thing. Like there were games that were targeted for adults, usually adult men, but it was seen as like a juvenile hobby to partake in. So that becomes like the status quo for a while, and then suddenly there are less and less girls and women playing video games because it's seen as a boy thing to do, so you're kind of like disincentivized as a girl to want to get into it. And then that makes it so that there just happens to be more boys and men who have been playing video games longer, have found out how to get better at video games over the time that they've played it, are more familiar with a lot of these systems, and because of that, become just generally better at the game because they've had more time to be in the ecosystem of not only just whatever specific game they're competitive in, but also games generally, because you can transfer a lot of the skills you've learned from other games to other ones in terms of like learning them and getting better at them. And that, like, generally speaking, that demographic holds true to the modern day competitive video gaming and esports. It's a lot of dudes, not a lot of girls in like the higher echelons of pro play. And it's not even necessarily because of just that either, because once you make it, you know, a situation where video games become a boys' club and you disincentivize women and girls from engaging with video games, that's going to create a system that these dudes are going to talk to each other about things outside of video games. And that's often going to lead to talks about, you know, women, generally speaking, and like how we feel about them and whatnot. And if there is like a lot of latent misogyny in a lot of people's minds and a lot of learned misogyny from, you know, the media they're watching or the politicians and the stuff that they're pushing or their friends and other stuff like that, then it's going to become kind of a breeding ground for anti-woman sentiment. You could see that a lot in the incel phenomenon and the nice guy phenomenon, where they just have really fucked views on women and their position in the world and how it relates to them as men. That does end up happening in esports as well, in these groups and even organizations, to the point where to be a woman or even a feminine person, or even a nameless, faceless person with a feminine voice on VC, or even a fucking a nameless, voiceless, faceless person with a feminine name or a feminine way of typing in a text chat, as soon as people kind of detect that you might be a woman or feminine, like all hell breaks loose. Either you're getting hit with misogyny or like thirst posting or both at the same time or both interacting with each other. You know, it's not good and it's not great to be in that position as the woman or femme or whatever. And one of the better ways to deal with that is, one, educate the men who are doing this and the boys who are doing this. And for two, allow for more women to be in the space so that the exposure kind of helps the dudes understand that they're just people like them and they have the capability of being chill and also good at the game. So that also disincentivizes women and girls from participating in esports, specifically competitive video gaming. And then you can get to the point where the organizations that are, you know, created, like a lot of esports teams, can also have a lot of misogyny in them as well, in the leadership and the people who have, you know, the drafting or like the choosing of players, those decisions that are being made. Oftentimes, it'll be people that were also subject to all that shit I was just talking about, and they're not going to want a woman on the team. So that could also influence why there aren't a lot of women on big pro teams. Not to say that's always the case, but that can have a part to play. So all of these hurdles are put up because of social factors for women and girls participating in esports. And that is very much reflected in physical athletics as well. Obviously, the context changes, but once sport became the domain of men, because be honest with yourself, nobody is paying attention to women's leagues. They're kind of like sequestered into the corner, and they never get talked about except for in the modern day in contemporary American politics, where it can be used as a weapon against trans people and queer people broadly, or like for misogynistic men gooning at women's volleyball or whatever. Like it's not a thing people care about, and people only care about the leagues that have the men in it. And that's not because of any biological advantage, it's purely social. That is to say, you know, like I say, testosterone does yield some benefits when it comes to progressing as an athlete, but that doesn't make men inherently better, or people who have testosterone as their dominant hormone any better. They have the capacity to be, but as we saw on that TikTok, it is not an essential 100% thing. So in the higher echelons of athleticism, the conversation becomes very, very complicated. Way more complicated than the like intro level basic biology that conservatives pretend to know but actually misunderstand. You know, it's way too complicated for that knowledge base, because we're talking about a bit of advanced biology at this point, and like they haven't gotten a grasp on basic biology, you know, so it's already a wash. They just want to have a minority to target, and trans people are very convenient. Anyway, so like that's the take. Anyway, so when we get to what we're seeing here, so we've seen the beginning, right, of this. The average people that are participating in parkrun are very intelligent, it would seem, and unfazed by the propaganda around trans people in sports. Specifically in this case, of course, a for fun event, parkrun, where, you know, times have been recorded. We can rewatch that, I guess, and then we'll get to how the reporter talks about it. So let's see what's good here, because the news anchor, the reporter here, is kind of like what I'm looking at more here, because like these people are based.
I think it's more of a hot topic when it comes to Olympics. When it comes to parkrun, I know parkrun's grown to a global event now, but I think people have got to remember as well that it is just a bit of a get-together, a bit of fun.
The debate about trans people in sports has been blown out of proportion, and I think make sports more inclusive. That's the conversation that we should be having.
Yeah. I think everyone should just go there and have fun. It's Saturday morning, 9 a.m. Like, let's all just go and have some fun and race. And if people want to look at the stats, then they can. If they don't,
I think just anyone and everyone should be able to do it and have access to it.
So controversial. What do we have here?
Now, the origin of this debate, this argument, seems to be a report by the right-leaning think tank Policy Exchange published last year, in which they found that at least 3 of the parkrun women's records were held by transgender women. And
oh, good heavens. Women are holding records in the women's category for this for fun event. I'm not sure when I'm meant to begin caring, but I don't think we've gotten to that point yet.
They encouraged parkrun to follow the example of for instance, UK and world athletics and divide the categories according to biological sex. That prompted an outcry. People divided according to, by now, familiar lines. But then what happened is overnight parkrun made this decision to take the records off the website, so you can no longer compare your time with anyone else's and see how you rank either at a local or national level. And they say officially that that had nothing to do with the transgender debate, that it was simply to make parkrun feel less like a race, to make it more inclusive. Now, that...
I think that's fine. I think that's fair. It's also possible that they just did not want the bullshit. Because, like, the times are superficial anyway. Like, they don't matter because it's a for-fun event as far as I'm aware. So, like, having them up can be cool. But it can also kind of make some people feel like shit who are doing it for fun, of course, but also would want to, like, know that they're doing okay. You know, like, if they are trying a little bit and it's not just like a... Because, like, I think it's fine to participate in a for-fun event and still, like, challenge yourself to get a good time. I think that's fine. I don't know that it needs to be a race, though. So, like, you could time yourself and share your times with your friends and other participants who have done this. But I don't know why the organization would need to have the times up. And I think that explanation, I don't think that's the whole story, frankly. I think it is because they didn't want to deal with the bullshit. And, you know, that's fair enough. Fair play. But I think that explanation of it being more like a fun event and less like a race, less like a competition, because it's not one, making that the vibe by doing that, I think that's also a fair reason to do it. So it's probably both, but you know.
May or it may not be true, but the timing of the decision has embroiled it nonetheless in this argument. And the CEO of parkrun, Russ Jeffrey, gave an interview yesterday in which he urged people to take the heat out of the debate. But given that the fires of this debate, if you like, have been raging for some considerable time, that feels like a forlorn hope. And it puts parkrun as a charity in a difficult position. As I say, officially their motto is to empower people to come together. And yet, whatever they decide, whatever they do on an issue this divisive, seems likely only to do precisely that and divide people.
Man, why is it divisive, though? That's my question. They always say it's a divisive issue. You know, these political issues, they can be divisive. Why exactly is it divisive? It's a good question, man. One day we may come up with an answer for why it's so divisive. Because the issue itself is not divisive by default in its nature, conceptually. Like, there's a very easy way to, like, talk about this complicated issue when it comes to trans women in the higher echelons of competitive sports. You can talk about that very calmly and not have it be, like, a partisan divide, you know? Because, like, you get together with a bunch of experts in sport and athletics and health workers that work with athletes and scientists, biological, you know, master's degree holders. You get a bunch of them together and be like, okay, what's good? How do we make this as fair as possible? Because people are saying it's potentially unfair. That's a boring conversation, though. That's not very fun to listen to or to watch, and it certainly doesn't get people to come out to vote for you. So I think the reason why it's divisive is not because the issue itself is something that people care about, because people, generally speaking, do not give a fuck about women's sports. It's unfortunate. It would be cool if people did more, but generally speaking, they don't. Mostly because female athletes and women in sport are sequestered into their own league. If they were allowed to participate in the men's leagues, and you would have, like, some people, some women do fairly well in those leagues, more respect would probably be given to female athletes and women athletes. That would be cool to see. I mean, it is a meritocracy after all. Why can't a woman who is capable of competing at that level with men not participate? Why is that against the rules? Kind of silly. I don't get it. I don't understand it. But it seems like it's a divisive issue because politicians have made it one in order to get people to vote for them out of fear of barely a percentage point of the population, because their actual policies aren't that great, like, you know, defunding the NHS, which would only further cripple an already decaying healthcare system in the UK, bruv. And, you know, giving more money to billionaires and the wealthy in the form of tax cuts and austerity politics and shifting the burden for the tax revenues onto the little guy, not being in favor of wage increases and whatnot. Obviously, a lot of this is the case in the US, but it's also the case in the UK. And in fact, the transphobia in the UK is kind of like ground zero when it comes to how this has all been. You know, kissless virginal women in the UK who call themselves gender criticals have been hooting and hollering about this for a long time for no perceived actual reason. and it's just kind of morphed and evolved into the beast we see today. It doesn't actually affect anybody in any real way. The average Joe is unaffected by the existence of trans people or even their participation in competitive sports in whatever league. But it's been made into one by politicians and also by segments like this. Because you could try your best to be like, oh, I'm not really taking a position in one way or another. I'm saying that no matter what the decision parkrun makes, it's going to be a bit of a divisive issue. Now, of course, as the media, I've got absolutely nothing to do with why it's been a divisive issue to begin with. It's not like we have a specific bent toward one side or the other when we talk about trans issues. It's simply because that's just the way that the world works and there's no actual real reason for it, and that's bullshit. Like, even if this guy is not transphobic and he's just trying his best to be, like, down the middle, to be a centrist in this position is to agree more with the right than the left, because the left is like, yeah, trans people are good and nice, actually, and should be able to exist and live their lives. And the right is like, no, actually, they shouldn't. I'm pretty sure the correct answer to that is that trans people should be allowed to exist in public society. And to have a centrist issue is like, what is your take then between those two? Is it like trans people should have a right to exist in the public in certain circumstances? Like, what's the caveat you're adding here as a centrist? Because it doesn't seem very objective like, you know, journalism is ostensibly supposed to be. The idea of objective journalism, like nonpartisan journalism, I don't think has ever existed. They pretend that it does. I don't know that it actually ever has. There is always going to be a bias in one way or another, either conscious or subconscious, because of societal forces and how the human species works in a social capacity. And this is good evidence of it. Like, this being the caption here, you know, facing backlash over its decision to scrap all-time records after a row of transgender elites taking female records. And then you have actual people, you know, people who are not brain poisoned by culture war bullshit from the right because they have no actual policies and just need to have a minority to hate in order to get people who are very fearful of people that aren't like them to vote for them and give them money. You have a bunch of normal-ass people who don't actually care and think trans people are fine, actually. And including trans people and all people, frankly, in events like this is nice. And then you have, you know, this bullshit fence-sitting, ooh, I'm not really taking a position, I'm just talking about the fact that there are positions to take. You're kind of giving more credence to one side than the other. So if it was your intention to be objective and apolitical and nonpartisan, you failed. Congratulations. But that's already a difficult ask because it's almost impossible to not allow a political bias in one way or another to change how you interpret an issue and present it to people. Anyway, so I just found that interesting. I found it quite like the juxtaposition between the media coverage and then like people actually asked about it. I just found that, you know, very interesting. And I figured, you know, I always have some things to say about it. Oh, I should also say, I forgot to add this when we were talking about why women and girls are less likely to play in a variety of sports in the specific context esports that I was talking about before. But of course, this works for other sports as well. One of the big reasons that women's leagues are formed as well, post the decision to make them to begin with in the first place, and the trend then that followed for there always having to be a segregation between men and women in competitive sports. A lot of the times those women's leagues will be created for a couple of reasons. One, because the misogyny makes it so difficult for them to get into it, that women's leagues are the only way they have a chance to play in competitive leagues. For two, it's because there aren't as many women and girls in competitive esports and other athletics, but specifically in this case, esports, because it's just a good example of something where like these so-called biological advantages can't possibly exist, where they barely do in, you know, physical sport. There are so few of them that the only way that they could participate would be to make their own league. It's a combination of a lot of these different factors, and that's just a band-aid on an open wound. Like, you haven't really dressed the wound. You've just kind of covered it up and moved it to a place where you're not looking at it. The problem here is the idea that men are inherently, like, essentially, biologically better than women, which is not the case. That's the issue, and if we were to fix that social issue in people's minds, through education, through including women in a variety of these sports, yada yada, it's going to be an uphill battle, but it would help us kind of right that wrong in people's minds. And you could still have it be meritocratic as well, because sports are one of the few places in our society where it is kind of a meritocracy. It's not perfect, but it's like closer than a lot of other competitions that our species engages with, because it requires a lot of labor and athleticism. So yeah, that's one of the big reasons why those leagues end up being created after the fact. Anyway, a bit of hope. It's just a bit of fun on a Saturday morning. It's a bit of hope for you in these dreary, bleak times. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, smash the like button. Absolutely Goomba stomp the sub button and have a good day.